Welcome back. You're still watching The World Today on Channels Television. In the United States now, U.S. President Joe Biden traveled to Nevada to promote his plan to cut healthcare costs by taxing high earners. During an event with doctors and nurses, Mr. Biden celebrated that as part of a plan to negotiate drug prices, 2 drug companies have slashed the prices they charge for insulin. Novo Nordisk said it will cut U.S. list prices for several insulin products by up to 75% next year, joining rival Eli Lilly as political pressure mounts to make these life-sustaining diabetes treatments more affordable to people. The move follows the passing of President Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act last year that capped insulin prices for Medicare recipients at $35 per month, but does not include patients without insurance.
You know, America spends more on prescription drugs than any advanced nation on earth. More than any advanced nation on earth. You name the drug you have to take, and I can take you to France and get it to you a hell of a lot cheaper, to Canada, England, throughout Europe. It's not fair. But after decades of trying to take on Big Pharma, we finally won. Now, instead of paying whatever the drug company wants to charge you, Medicare will be able to negotiate prices. Guess what? The good news is that Eli Lilly, the biggest insulin maker in the United States of America, announced that they're going to answer my call and they're going to make this insulin available to everyone in America for $35. And yesterday, Novartis, another drug maker, announced they're cutting their prices for insulin as well. How many here have had you or a family member be diagnosed with cancer? Raise your hand. My Republican friends say, what are you going to cut taxes for the wealthy? I said, no, I got a better way of saving money. Not a joke. If, in fact, you limit the amount of money that can be charged to reasonable prices by the drug companies, you know how much you'll save this year? $160 billion. $160 billion. Why? Because it's $160 billion less they have to pay out to provide the drugs for the seniors. There were 550 companies of the Fortune 500 that made $40 billion that didn't pay a penny in tax, zero, nothing in taxes. So I said the outrageous, and we got votes for it. I said they ought to pay a minimum of 15%. 15%, that's less than y'all pay. Guess what? It allowed me to cut the deficit. So, folks, this is about just basic fairness and decency. There's nothing radical about what I'm proposing. And if you look at the polling data, it's overwhelmingly popular, what we proposed. Matter of fact, it's a hell of a lot more popular than I am. Look, folks.
And in the United Kingdom, British Finance Minister Jeremy Hunt on Wednesday said the freshly announced childcare expansion package is just the start to get more people into work. Speaking at a visit in South London Children's Nursery, Mr. Hunt said the reform package is an ambitious way to break the barriers preventing people with children from working due to prohibiting cost of childcare in the UK. In a bid to speed up growth, Mr. Hunt announced the expansion of free childcare to children under 2 in England as a way to get more parents of young children into work. Campaigners said the £4 billion of annual funding would not meet demand. Independent forecasters at the Office for Budget Responsibility said that it was hard to judge the impact of Mr. Hunt's attempt to get more workers into jobs markets, and it warned the share of people in work or looking for it was set to hit 23-year low next year before rising.
Do you like pink? This is the most ambitious package of reforms to get rid of the barriers, to help us fill 1 million vacancies, and it's just the start. The OBR say that it could help get nearly 250,000 people back to work, but I think we have never seen before such a comprehensive attempt to say that in this country if people want to work, we should take away the barriers. And that doesn't matter if you're an older person, someone who's disabled, someone who's looking for work, a parent worried about childcare costs. The government is on your side. If you want to work, we want to help you. Well, of course we want to help older people who want to stay in work, and by definition they will generally be on higher salaries. But nearly 5 times more help is going to young parents to help them with childcare costs, a nearly 60% reduction in childcare costs, £6,500 a child. That will make a huge difference to families, but also it will make a huge difference to businesses who worry, particularly smaller businesses, that they're losing valuable employees when they start a family.
Our correspondent Juliana Olayinka joins us online now from London. Hello, Juliana.
Hi, Anne.
And now we've seen forecasters saying that job will hit 23-year low next year before further rising. But what are the key provisions that Mr. Hunt is doing in terms of budget, especially as they relate to work, pensions, and even energy bills in the UK?
Yeah, I think we should have to have a look at the wider context of the spring budget, which was delivered just over 24 hours ago. And I think the reaction here in the UK and across the world has been pretty much lukewarm. And I think that's because of a couple of things. I think, firstly, it's because of the global economic backdrop. And so, of course, most of the markets, most of the financial headlines at the moment are targeted towards whether or not we are likely to enter some sort of banking crisis. Of course, this follows the SVB collapse on Friday, the bailout by the US Treasury. And then, of course, we had that overnight breaking news about the struggles that Credit Suisse has been having. And then, of course, they secured that $50 billion loan from the Swiss central bank. So that's where most of the headlines are going today. But then also, I think one of the reasons why it was a lukewarm reaction is because it was a pretty lukewarm statement given by the Chancellor, who was, of course, brought in to replace Kwasi Kwarteng, his predecessor, to show the markets that Britain can have a steady pair of hands. And it was a kind of steady budget. The government have described it as a budget for growth. Some would say it was a budget for families and for getting people back into work, which is what you were talking about, Anne, with this new state-wide provision for families. So if you are watching this from the UK, or if anybody watching from Nigeria that knows people in the UK, you know that people do struggle to pay nursery bills. They cost an extortionate amount. And I think because we have over 6 million working-aged adults economically inactive, one of the strategic means to growth is to try and get these people back into work. And according to the government's own calculations, there are about 2.2 million people who are staying at home, quite simply because they just can't afford to put their children into nursery. So I think for many, many people, including the Labour Party, which, to be fair, you know, this statewide provision was a Labour idea, most people are really happy with this because, of course, that means that they can start going back out to work. The only criticism from that policy is that it's not going to start until 2025. So with all of these government statements, as you know, Anne, you've got to really scratch beneath the surface to try and find what the detail is. So that is a good thing, but we're not going to get that for a couple of years. I think the most contentious part of yesterday's budget has got to be this abolition of the abolishment of this tax for pensions. So at the moment, you can have a pension fund and not pay any tax on it. But as soon as your pension fund reaches over £1 million, you have to pay an additional tax. And according to the Conservative government, this has stopped people from working longer because they just don't want to pay any tax on their pensions, and they'd rather have £1 million in their account and say bye-bye to their profession. And they believe that's also preventing the labour market from growing. That only affects about 15,000 people, most of them doctors, yes, and we know the NHS is struggling. So having these doctors you know, away from the golf course, back into the ward would be great. But then Labour have called this, you know, basically a tax cut for the wealthiest 1%. And we do know that's a Conservative winner. Conservative governments, Conservative budgets do like to appease to their voters, and they are typically the wealthiest in society. So, you know, it was slightly underwhelming, not much headline grabbing in the UK today. As I said, most of the focus now is to ensure that we don't get into this 2008 financial crisis, which of course we saw 15 years ago.
All right, Juliana, how did Wales and Scotland fare in this budget?
Well, Wales and Scotland are devolved institutions here in the UK. I do believe there was about £330 million given as additional revenue to the Scottish government, which the outgoing Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon did recognise. She thanked the Chancellor but said it just doesn't do enough. But with the devolved governments around the United Kingdom, they typically look after their own budgets, so not much in a way for them specifically. There were UK-wide schemes, and then there were schemes for specifically England, like this expansion of state-free childcare.
I know you've talked about the reaction not being so, I mean, people not really receiving it with excitement, but when you compare this reaction to that of the one put out by Liz Truss government last year, how would you compare both this season and last year?
Goodness me, it's yeah, that's a difference between night and day, and there was market turmoil. In fact, there are some people that said they lost £15,000 overnight. I know it wiped off billions from the UK blue chip index. And look, you know, that's what Jeremy Hunt has been brought in to do. He is a stalwart politician, very much statesman-like figure. He had the autumn statement just after Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss were booted out of office. But then, you know, if you look back at where we were in September to where we were now, we're in a completely different place. In fact, you know, Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, started off his announcement at the dispatch box yesterday by announcing that the UK, despite its naysayers, won't enter into a technical recession this year. That is good news. And it's also a stark contrast to what we heard from the International Monetary Fund just a couple of weeks ago. In fact, it's a stark contrast from what we heard from Britain's own central bank. Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor, forecast that we would be in our deepest, darkest recession this year. That's not going to happen. That is a really good thing. And also very bright news is the fact that inflation has peaked. According to the government's own forecasters, that 10.1%, which I believe we received in October last year, is the end of skyrocketing prices. He expects and anticipates inflation to fall to about 2.9% by the end of this year. That is a huge sigh of relief for individuals. Also as well, another giveaway, because again, even if you're not politically savvy like you, and you know, everyday people do watch the budget because they are looking for some sort of giveaways. And I think for the ordinary man in the street in the UK, I think the announcement that the £2,500 energy price guarantee, which was one good thing about Liz Truss, because she was the Prime Minister that put that in place, that is going to stay. So it was to come to an end in April. It's now been shifted for a further quarter. So again, it does give people a little bit of comfort that no matter what happens in the war, which of course is just a stone's throw away from where we are on the mainland, our energy prices are not going to go any higher than that. The only thing is, again, as you get with critics and opposition party leaders, they're saying, what if energy goes lower? If it does go much lower, which is what we're seeing, are we going to get a reduction even further? So there were a couple of giveaways, and there were, of course, winners and losers. But I think overall, you know, the difference between what we had in the Boris Johnson and the Liz Truss days to what we have with Rishi Sunak's days is much more calmer. And I think the markets have been reassured that Britain may, in fact, be on its way back to growth.
Juliana, just before I let you go quickly, is there any provision for developmental aid, especially for Africa, in that budget?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, no mention of that. There was some suggestions. Well, actually, there is a new policy. I believe £11 million is going to be given to Ukrainians that are living in the UK. And of course, it was Commonwealth Day on Monday. I know Jeffrey Nyema, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, is here speaking with his counterpart, James Cleverly. Let's see if there is going to be any shift with the foreign aid and overseas budget. I pretty much doubt it, even though it's very much needed.
All right, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Juliana Olayinka from London, thanks for your time and your thoughts on the world today.
Thank you.
Welcome back. The trilateral security partnership between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, known as AUKUS, is the worst international decision made by a Labour Party government since World War II. And these are words of former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating. The former Prime Minister, who served in the post from 1991 to 1996, made his criticisms at the National Press Club of Australia. The Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, US President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had jointly announced Australia's acquisition of nuclear submarines. Local newspaper, The Australian, estimated that the deal will cost $268 billion to $368 billion Australian dollars, and that's about $178 billion to $245 billion US dollars by mid-2050. 8 AUKUS class submarines will be built and the capital of South Australia, with the first to be completed by the year 2042. But in the interim, Australia will acquire 3 US-made Virginia-class subs as soon as early 2030s. The British and US submarines will begin regular port visits and the rotational presence in Australia. Mr. Keating elaborated on his opinion on Wednesday that the current government is falling into a major mistake with an American sword to rattle at the neighborhoods to impress upon it the United States' esteemed view of its untrammeled destiny. China opposes certain countries attempting to form exclusive circles in response to a question regarding South Korea's president visiting Japan. Japan and South Korea agreed to drop an almost 4-year-old trade dispute on high-tech materials today, an emphatic sign that they aim to rebuild a relationship strained by history and work together against deepening security threats. The announcement came during Yoon Suk-yeol's visit to Japan today, and that's the first for a South Korean president in 12 years, as the two neighbors look for common grounds in the face of frequent North Korean missile launches.
China opposes certain countries' attempts to form close and exclusive circles. We hope that Japan-South Korea relations will develop in a direction conducive to regional peace, stability, and prosperity.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has said they will seek to boost European competitiveness through reforms at an EU summit in Brussels next week, including making state aid more flexible and completing capital markets and banking unions. In a speech to the German Bundestag, Scholz urged the European Union to pull together to face a raft of challenges, including in response to a massive US subsidy program for clean technologies known as the Inflation Reduction Act. European solidarity has repeatedly been tested in recent years as the blocs seek to keep pace with the US and China economically and even support Ukraine to repel Russia's invasion.
That is why we will be looking very closely at the EU's competitiveness at next week's European Council. Our competitiveness is the prerequisite for economic success, and our competitiveness is a prerequisite for Europe's future. As a geopolitical player, of course, it is important to me that Germany is a leader and attractive when it comes to investment and innovation. But at the same time, it is clear that our European internal market can only function together. In the long run, We will only have a competitive and weatherproof economy here in Germany if Europe as a whole is strong. It is crucial to promote climate-friendly investments and innovations in Europe even more strongly and in a more targeted manner. Next week, in Brussels, we will discuss the necessary framework conditions for this. In the run-up to the meeting, the German government has campaigned vigorously and successfully to make the European state aid rules more flexible. In doing so, we are at the same time addressing the very needs of companies here in our country. The Commission's idea on speeding up planning and approvals also points in the right direction. And of course, the competitive European Union needs the completion of the capital market and banking union. We will only be competitive and successful in the long run on the basis of stable budgets throughout Europe. This week, the European finance ministers hammered out the reform of the Stability Pact. And even though we still have a lot of work ahead of us, we will set down the progress we have now made at the European Council, and we will build on it. This certainly.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Berlin for talks on Iran and other issues today, leaving crisis back home over the judicial overhaul by his far-right coalition that has triggered mass protests in recent weeks. Mr. Netanyahu met German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is seeking to reaffirm support for Israel while also conveying German unhappiness with Netanyahu's plans. The Israeli government's drive to limit Supreme Court powers while increasing its own power is selecting judges has caused alarm at home and abroad about the country's democratic checks and balances. Mr. Netanyahu shortened his trip to the German capital and will leave again this evening. And in Africa, police and demonstrators clashed again in Senegal's capital, Dakar, today ahead of a court case involving opposition leader and presidential aspirant who has gained widespread support among much of the country's youth. Police fired tear gas at hundreds of Sonko supporters as they trailed vehicles taking him to court for the resumption of a libel case against him. Protesters burned tires in the streets and hurled stones at the police and outlets of the French supermarket chain, and several buses were also set on fire. Sonko, who is 48, who came third in the 2019 presidential election, is charged with raping a beauty salon employee back in 2021 and making death threats against her. He denies any wrongdoing, saying the accusations are politically motivated. Thursday's skirmishes are the latest of the round of unrest in Senegal, where presidential elections are scheduled for February next year. And the country has long been seen as a place of stability and democracy in the restive region, a reputation shaken by deadly violence over the last 2 years. But much of this anger is targeted towards President Macky Sall, whose failure to rule out for the third term in office has angered many people. Senegal's constitution only allows 2 terms, but some fear that Mr. Sall will use a recent tweak to the constitution to reset his mandate, repeating a tactic which was used by other rulers to extend power in the region. And that's it on The World Today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Nwawadu. Please stay safe.